Hello, welcome to lecture number 4, the English and the Turkey 2, the settling of North America by the Brits. Um, we're going to zero in on and focus on the 1600s for this lecture. The key points, the Sea Dogs, reasons for British expansion, exploitation, exploration, Jamestown and John Smith, Plymouth, the Pilgrims, and Squanto, and William Penn and the Quakers. So those are your key points. And this is where we're really getting into what will be basically the bread and butter of the class. We're going to be getting into the birth of the United States of America. All right. To kind of get into it, during the late 1400s, 1500s, the British were out exploring the world much like the Spaniards, but they did not have a foothold in the Americas. This would change by the beginning of the 1600s, and one of the major people that it would change with would be Sir Francis Drake. Sir Francis Drake was a nobleman and what we in the history field refer to as a sea dog. All right. Sea dogs are your first key point of the day. And with the sea dogs, basically the only difference between a sea dog and a pirate is that the Sea Dogs were noble. They were hired by the crown to do it. In other words, Sir Francis Drake, went out onto the high seas and plundered. And the main group that Drake went after were the Spanish. He would hit the Spanish ships in the Atlantic as they were coming back from the Caribbean, and would take huge, huge amounts of wealth from the Spaniards. In the long run, this type of piracy with the Sea Dogs would end up creating a huge, huge problem between England and Spain, and they would end up going to war. This war would go from 1588 until 1604, and in the end, this war would help move the British Empire to the forefront. Once the British defeated the Spanish, things opened up, especially here in America for the Brits. But also, let's talk a little bit about why the British needed to expand. A lot of these reasons for expansions, exploration, exploitation are the same as they were in the Columbus lecture. First and foremost, population explosion. You had a very large boom in the British population, and they needed more land. They needed more food. Also, like I said, with the population explosion, they were running out of land. They were running out of resources. They were running out of everything. So they had to acquire more. Another big thing that occurred during this time is that you have a huge unemployment rate. What caused this is the aristocracy, the nobles, the landowners, threw the peasants out. They threw them off the land, and the peasants were forced off on their own. They had nowhere to go, nothing to do, basically, but most of them would end up gravitating towards the cities. The reason that they would be thrown off the land, off of what they'd been farming and working on for generations, is that the British found a new thing to do with the land. They fenced off their massive estates and raised sheep. Wool became a big, big thing for the British. This was easy. They did not need the peasants with this because there are no natural predators to sheep in England. So just keep them fenced in. They're basically safe, and you can make a lot of money off of selling the wool. So with this, you also have rapid inflation. Anytime you have a drastically changing economy, the monetary note goes into fluctuation. Also, religion. You had religious problems in the British Isles. The Puritans, the separatists, you had several factions of the Episcopalian Church that did not agree with the church and wanted to do its own, they wanted to do their own things, or they wanted to purify the church. So you have a lot of religious animosity in the British Isles. And with the separatists and the Puritans, they'd be some of the ones that would leave and help found colonies here in the U.S. All right, so we got a little bit of the background. Let's talk about the first settlements. Roanoke is considered to be the first British settlement in the New World. This happens in basically present-day North Carolina in what is referred to as the Outer Banks. The British would try this 2 times in the 1580s, and both times Roanoke would fail. First time, it was just gentlemen explorers settling in, trying to find gold, find precious jewels, and get out. The second one, they were mainly families. They were coming there to settle and colonize, but they weren't prepared. And so both of these attempts at settlement would fail. However, the British would learn a lot. They would learn, what not to do, basically, from these 2 failed attempts in the New World at Roanoke. And at the beginning of the 1600s, Parliament started organizing what would become the Virginia Company. And with the Virginia Company, Parliament would invest a lot of money, a lot of man hours, and pulling in a lot of people to get the first colony in the Americas. They would hire Captain Christopher Newport, and Newport would bring over 144 settlers. He would bring them over on the Godspeed, the Discovery, and the Susan Constance. These are the 3 ships that brought the very first British settlers to America. Most of the time, when you think of the first settlers in America, you think of the Pilgrims and Plymouth, right, on the Mayflower. That comes more than a decade after this. So the first permanent British settlement in the New World in the Americas is Jamestown. And Christopher Newport and his 3 ships bring the first settlers. It does not go well. This first settling of Jamestown starts in 1607, and basically for the first 15 years of existence, Jamestown is barely surviving. The British are constantly bringing in supplies, and even with all this help from back home, it is a struggle to survive and adjust to this very new environment. One of the people that comes in and helps them adjust in Jamestown is John Smith. I'm sure you guys and gals have heard of John Smith, if nothing else from the Disney movie Pocahontas. Supposedly, according to American folklore and legend, Pocahontas and John Smith had a thing, right? They had a relationship, which is actually false. Pocahontas and John Smith never had any kind of a relationship. Pocahontas would actually marry John Rolfe. Rolfe would be the one that would actually make Jamestown successful. He would be a tobacco planter and really kick off the plantation system in Virginia and make it a success for the British. But Smith would help the colony survive. Smith was basically a military-like leader, a despot. He ruled with an iron fist. He made sure everybody did the work they had to do. All right. One of the famous quotes from Smith is, "He who work not eats not." All right. So Smith really pushed and promoted hard work, even by the aristocrats. Anybody and everybody had to contribute to make this thing work. Um, like I said, Smith would keep it going for a few years until he was taken out of the equation. Um, the natives didn't like him because he was military, but he was never taken out by them. Evidently, people in Jamestown accidentally took him out. One night in the spring, John Smith was sleeping out under the stars, and somebody accidentally put a keg of gunpowder too close to the fire and blew him up. Um, it didn't kill him. He would heal and want vengeance, but uh, he would recover enough to go home. He suffered from the wounds and side effects of this explosion for the rest of his life, which wasn't that long. But Smith would play an important role in the founding, and until 1609, play an important role in keeping Jamestown from falling apart into chaos. Kind of give you a little background on Smith. Smith is, in many ways, a lot like Columbus. He comes from nothing. His father was a farmer, a peasant farmer. He did not want to be a peasant farmer. He did not want to die with dirt under his nails, he said. So he wanted to be a sailor, go out and make a name for himself. But it turns out that he was a little too smart and too good with bookkeeping, and all the shipping places kept him behind a desk. He hated it. He wanted a life of adventure, so he ran off. In his early years, there was the last crusade that was finally going on with some of the European kingdoms down fighting Islam in the Middle East, and John Smith would go down and join them. He would become known as a very ferocious fighter. With this, while his time down in the Crusades, this is where the Smith family gets its coat of arms. It is a black shield with 3 severed heads on it, and it is because of his exploits. He was so good that he was hired to come in and do the duels between the leaders. Sometimes, instead of having a full-out battle, the leaders would pick their champions to go out on the field and fight it out. And Smith became well known for this. Finally, he was in a battle that did not go well for his side, and he was captured and sold into slavery. However, as the Russian Cossack that bought him was taking him back to where she was from, one night he escaped his bondage and supposedly killed everyone in the camp and disappeared into the night. And after this, 3 years later, pops up back in England. And with this is when he would start going to the Americas. They would put him on ships and send him out. He would be the one that would end up going up and down the coastline of the Atlantic coastline of the U.S. and mapping it out for the British. And also kind of getting an idea of what Native American groups were in those areas. So you get a little bit of Jamestown and John Smith. Once John Smith takes up this Jamestown adventure and ends up there and injured and has to go back home, Jamestown spirals out of control. It does not go well once he's gone. And in 1609, you have one of the most horrific events in early American history. It's called the Starving Time. With this, you hear all kinds of stories of how people ran out of food very quickly and, resorted to killing and hunting and getting everything they could from the animals and gathering everything they can from the woods After they ran out of that, they started killing all the domestic animals. Once they ran out of the domestic animals, they started hunting and eating rats and anything else they could scavenge. When times really got desperate, they started digging up the dead and eating them. They started with the Native Americans, went to their own, and very soon after that, they resorted to killing people and eating them. Cannibalism all out. Just outright cannibalism. One of the old stories is that one man had killed his wife and kids and figured out a way to dehydrate them and ground them up into powder and kept them in a little keg where he would mix it with water and eat them to survive. Another one of the stories is that this one guy said he'd found a store of meat that he'd forgot he had and he wanted to share it with his neighbors. So his neighbors came over, they had a big party that night, and at the party, as the story goes, one of his neighbors notices that his wife and kids aren't around, and nobody's seen him the whole night at the party. So the guy starts questioning and asking the guy all about it, and then the guy says, well, what do you think you guys were eating tonight? So the story is that he served his own family to his neighbors. This starving time drove people mad. The only time ships were not coming into Jamestown was during the dead of winter. All right, so during the winter months, they'd be on their own, having to survive. But all the other time, ships would be coming in and going out, constantly trading and keep them replenished and bringing more people in. By the time 1609 occurred, they had more than 600 people in Jamestown. But when the British come after the starving time, that spring, there's only like 60 people left, and most of them had been driven mad by hunger and what they saw. So basically, after the starving time, Jamestown gets a reboot. All right, they have to start all over because the people that had been left, there were so few of them, and the ones that were left over, those few, those 60 or less, were basically taking care of the rest of their lives because they were not capable of taking care of themselves anymore. So we got the first settlement. But remember, after this rough beginning, it would become a very profitable colony. John Rolfe, like I said, would start off tobacco as a major crop in the South, and this would bring in huge amounts of money for the British Empire. So that is the bringing in what we were talking about last time with encomienda, with the plantation system as we know it is Rolfe. All right, so we've got the South and the beginnings of the United States and the colonies. Now let's move north. Let's talk about the northern colonies. Let's get into and talk about the Pilgrims. I mean, the Pilgrims are what you grew up listening to, the stories about, how they're the ones that founded democracy in America, freedom of religion, free politics, started Thanksgiving. You guys have all seen the pictures, and you probably had the little cutouts and everything else, and did the little drawings in school growing up. The Pilgrims in their black suits with their buckles on their shoes and their hats and all that kind of stuff. None of that's real. All right. The Pilgrims were not the Pilgrims. That was something that was created in the 1860s. During the Civil War, America was going through a very hard time. And Lincoln, during 1863, declared a Thanksgiving holiday to be on the fourth Thursday of every November, as a time to stop everything, take a break, not do anything but spend time with your family and be thankful for what you have. And it's during this time frame that the Victorian culture in America created what we think of as the Pilgrims. You know, the whole idea of the little black suits, the buckles, them being friends with the natives teaching them all of this stuff and how to survive. The Mayflower, how they came over with the Mayflower Compact and created democracy. All the stories that you were taught are just folklore. All right. The real story is a lot more complex. All right. So that's what we're going to focus on, is talking a little bit more about the Plymouth and Pilgrims. But it's important to remember that they were not Pilgrims. That was a name created by the Victorians in America in the 1860s and after. They actually were the Separatists. The Separatists were a faction of of the Protestant church that came over from England. The Separatists were very conservative, very hardcore in their religious beliefs and how they believed it should be conducted. They believed that the the Anglican Church of England was corrupt and lazy. And they had a lot of fights back and forth between the Anglican Church and the Separatists. And the Separatists finally decided to leave. So first they left and fled to Holland. All right. With the Separatists, they head to Holland to get rid of, to escape religious persecution. But one of the things they found out in Holland is it was way too free. The Dutch were too open. And the kids were converting to Dutch ways. They were leaving the religion, becoming very secular. And the devil may care, I guess you could say. And this was horrendous for the separatist beliefs. So they packed everything back up, gathered the kids back up, and went back to England, went back into persecution so they could keep their kids in the flock. However, by 1621, the separatists, or the Pilgrims, however you want to put it, would sail to the Americas. And they get their name from this, right? Pilgrims means it's a person on a religious voyage, right? These people left England because of religious persecution to come to America for religious freedom. Hence why the Victorians nicknamed them the Pilgrims. So the separatists, the first separatists to come, would come over in 1621 aboard Captain Christopher Jones's ship, the Mayflower. All right. All in all, there were 102 people on this boat. All right. Captain Jones was an experienced captain. The Mayflower was a good ship. So Jones brought all of these settlers over. However, this is where it gets tricky. Everybody was supposed to settle in Jamestown, and that's where the Mayflower was heading, supposedly to Jamestown. As the story goes, as you're taught, the Pilgrims that were on board and all these other people that were coming over to Jamestown to settle, they got hit by a massive storm in the Atlantic, and it blew them way off course. And they end up landing in Massachusetts rather than in Virginia. More than likely, that's not true. That's a really easy thing to fix, and there's no way you could be blown off that far off course and not recover from it, unless you sank. The more likely explanation was that the Pilgrims, the separatists that were on board, there were only 35 of them out of that 102. Those 35 separatists supposedly, and may have, bribed the ship captain to take them north rather than Jamestown. They didn't want to go to Jamestown because that would still be under the British Crown and they'd still be under British rule. They wanted their own thing. So it's possible that these Pilgrims, these separatists, bribed the ship captain to take them north. They would move into Massachusetts, go into Massachusetts Bay and search, look around for the perfect place. All right. Finally, they decided on Plymouth. More than anything was because they were running out of supplies. All right. They finally settled at Plymouth. Here's a direct quote from one of the journals. We could not take time for further search or consideration, our victuals being much spent, especially our beer. So they're running out of food, but more importantly, they're running out of beer, so they had to stop, really start up a colony, and get things going. Um, so when they get out and they settle Plymouth, the first thing they do is create an alehouse, place to brew beer. Then after that, they create a community building, and then after that, they start building houses and a church. So you have the founding. I remember the story growing up. The Pilgrims came over, they were blown off course, and they landed at Plymouth Rock, right? This is a big story when we were growing up. More than likely, there was never such a thing as Plymouth Rock. All right. But when they would arrive, the majority of the passengers were not happy because they had signed up and got on the boat to go to Jamestown, an established colony, not to go to the frozen hinterlands of North America. But what would happen is the separatists, under men like William Bradford, who was the leader of the separatists for quite some time, Bradford would convince those men and women on the boat to stay. The way he looked at it, you know, more people the merrier. The more people there, the more likely it is that they would survive and they could build something that would last. So, with this, they come in, they settle, and it's a very, very very tough first couple of seasons. It does not look like they're going to survive, and then a gift. But before we get to that, I forgot. I need to tell you how Bradford and the others convinced the other people to stay. And more than likely was one of the integral early documents in the Northeast, the Mayflower Compact. All right. Bradford promised all of those men and women that if they stayed and worked with the Pilgrims and helped create Plymouth, that they would be able to be involved in a body politic. In other words, he promised that all men, once they reached the age of maturity, they could participate in government and have a say in government. This was unprecedented. The British had never, British peasants, British people for the most part, had never had anything like this, and it was worth it. So this really solidified things, and this solidified the settlers at Plymouth. So once they start working, once they start establishing themselves, it was not easy. And like I said, the only thing that saved them in the end would be the natives. They would end up meeting the Wampanoag tribe. All right. And the main person that would come out of this and help them would be Squanto. All of you guys and gals have probably heard of Squanto. He's the one that taught them to fish in the American traditions, how to plant corn, taught them about corn, taught them how to hunt the American ways, and basically gave them the survival skills they needed to make it their first few years here in the Americas. According to all the stories, it's Squanto that taught them all of these things, and this would all help lead to the first Thanksgiving, right? That the Pilgrims, after this help from the natives, would have a bountiful harvest and would invite the natives for a feast. And that is the story that the Victorians give us as the Pilgrims. In all reality, it wasn't that easy. They did make friends with a few tribes, but the main tribes, like the Massasoit and the Wampanoags, became their allies. But those tribes weren't the more powerful tribes in the area. One of the big tribes in the area was the Pequot. So what would end up happening is the the Wampanoags, the Massasoit, and the Pilgrims, the Separatists, would come together and start a war with the Pequots. Um, and the Pilgrims, or Separatists, however you want to say it, would end up basically wiping the Pequots out. From 1636 to 1637, the Separatists go to war with the Pequots, with the Wampanoags and the Massasoit help, and would run the Pequots out of the area. It was a mass genocide. Bradford, in his journals, would talk about some of the raids. Most of the time, they would go kill them at night. They'd come up on these Pequot villages and burn them alive in their housing. And the ones that would come out into the night, be running at the running to the Separatists in the dark, trying to get away from the fire, they would just shoot them down. This was one of the major things of the warfare, how they conducted war against the Pequots. So you have this mass genocide. And with this, the Wampanoags, the Massasoit, and the Separatists divide up all this new land. And Massachusetts grows more and more. During this time, more and more Separatists come over. But by the time of the 1630s and 1640s and moving on into the latter part of the 1600s, the Puritans start coming over in very large numbers and settle in places like Boston, Salem, and really Massachusetts takes off. So we've got Jamestown, at the beginning of the American colonies. The first one settled in 1607 and becomes successful economically and kicks in the plantation system with tobacco labor and slavery. Then we have the Separatists, or the Pilgrims, coming into the Northeast and establishing a different kind of world and trade. And we'll get more into the economics of it when we talk about colonial America. All right. The last little bit. The last thing we need to talk about are the Restoration colonies. The Restoration colonies are a little strip in between the North and the South. Think of it as Pennsylvania, Delaware, that whole area. Pennsylvania, Delaware, Rhode Island, that whole little strip right through there. And Pennsylvania is the big one. In the late 1600s, William Penn wants to come over and create something new. William Penn is the son of Penn the Greater, one of the more powerful British aristocrats of the time, and definitely one of the richest. When he's growing up, he becomes a Quaker, and the Quakers are this religious group that believes that everybody has divine life. Everybody is equal. Everybody, it's a different look. It does not support aristocracy. And he is in trouble constantly, being in and out of jail all the time and protest against British handling of things. Finally, William Penn, with his vast family fortune, talks the British into letting him kind of purchase what he would call Pennsylvania, which means Penn's Woods. The British were in desperate need of money at the time, had a huge debt, so Penn gave them a lot of money. And they let Penn and the Quakers come to the U.S. and start up Pennsylvania. They would come in and would found the city of Philadelphia. Philadelphia was open to all. This is where true religious freedom begins, not with the separatists. The separatists that settled in, they wanted freedom of their religion. But with the Quakers and William Penn in Philadelphia, anybody could practice. You could be Jewish, Catholic, Quaker, um, you know, Puritan, separatist, Episcopalian. It didn't matter. They had true religious freedom in Philadelphia. And in 1682, Penn would create the first frame of government. The first frame of government would establish a democratic state and promote the freedom of the individual in Pennsylvania. Also, as Philadelphia grew, as it would turn into Pennsylvania, Penn and the leaders of Pennsylvania had a very, very good relationship with the Native Americans. The Native Americans in that area were the Delaware, and they had control of most of that land. And as it worked, the leaders of the Pennsylvania colony, as they grew and as they got bigger, as they needed more, they would go to the Delaware and ask for more land, to purchase more land. Sometimes the Delaware would sell it to them, sometimes they wouldn't, but the Pennsylvanians always respected the Delaware's wishes. So you actually have cohabitation, in a manner of speaking, between the natives and the Brits in the Pennsylvania area. So you get some of the first colonies. All right, I want you guys and gals to keep it in mind. You have Jamestown in 1607. You have the coming of the separatists/pilgrims in 1621, and later on, in the latter part of the 1600s, in the latter part of the 1600s, you have Pennsylvania. All of these are very different types of settlements, but all of them would contribute to creating important aspects of the 13 colonies, which we will get into in our next lecture. Everybody have a good afternoon.